Hello, everybody. My name is Bill Cope, and I'm pleased to be able to join you at this virtual conference of the English Teachers Association of Queensland, and to run this session, which is called a Masterclass. It's probably more realistic that we should call it yet another Zoom meeting, but I'm recording this one, so it's actually, the meeting is with myself and a recording. So strange world this is. So anyhow, I work at the University of Illinois, and you can tell that I don't have an Illinois accent. I'm originally from Australia, and in fact, for a number of years, lived in Queensland. I worked at the James Cook University in Townsville, so that was some of the best years of my life living there. So I'm pleased to be back in Queensland in this virtual kind of state. So as is sort of customary, what I'm going to do is do a PowerPoint presentation, which will help me scaffold what I'm doing and help you through thinking through what some of the ideas are in this session. And the focus of the conference is on feedback. So that's what I'm going to be looking at in this particular presentation. So I'm going to share my screen now and bring you over to a PowerPoint presentation that I have. The theme, as I say, is about feedback. And what I'm going to do is run through 3 digital media strategies. My background is the area of literacy, and particularly the writing, not the reading side, or the writing more than the reading side of literacy. And you're going to see a lot of writing happening in these digital media strategies along the way. So in this talk, basically, I'm going to give 3 examples of digital strategies. One I call digital classroom discourse, feedback in a kind of a classroom discussion environment. The second one is crowdsourcing feedback in rubric-based assessments and using an online environment to do that. And the third example, which is not so readily achievable, but we've been working on in the R&D we've been doing, is big data, learning analytics, and artificial intelligence as feedback systems. And interestingly, what they're doing a lot of the time is they're actually dealing with language, apropos of you folks, your interest as language teachers. So my first example, digital classroom discourse as feedback. This is the classic pattern of feedback in a classroom. And this is using the acronym IRE, and teacher initiates, student responds, teacher evaluates. And this is documented with a great deal of profundity and subtlety by Courtney Kasdan in her very important and quite famous book, Classroom Discourse. So this is how it goes. Teacher initiates, and they might say, what's the furthest planet from the sun in the solar system? And the students respond by shooting up their hands, but only actually one person can answer. And the game of answering is to second guess what the teacher expects the answer to be. So there isn't much space for alternative answers in this kind of discourse. And then what happens is the teacher evaluates. The teacher says, yes, that's correct. Or she might have an alternative answer, which is, no, that's wrong. Does somebody else have the answer? So this is the classic pattern of classroom discourse, which, if you like, is a kind of a set of feedback loops, IRE, initiate, respond, evaluate. Now, what can we say about that as a form of feedback, right? The reason why I'm doing this is I'm going to contrast what's possible in digital environments. And I'm going to be here talking about the old school, the school you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, but also its digital replicants. So when we do this in Zoom, have a classroom discourse event, conversation, and one person responds orally, it's the same kind of thing. So there's a lot of, what we've done with the digital world a lot of time is simply use it to replicate what happens in the traditional classroom context. So one person responds, that's the first point. It's not realistic to have how many kids in that classroom there, 20-something, 30-something, all saying Pluto. It's redundant. The second thing is it's the wrong person. It's the person who's the teacher chooses, the person who's enthusiastic, the person who puts up their hand first, and usually it's the least, the least suitable person. The third thing is that this is a purely oral discourse. Not necessarily a bad thing, but what's interesting is how this shifts in the digital world. But also, these kind of things are ephemeral, they're forgettable, it disappears into the ether. And what we do, as I mentioned before, is the game is to second guess the right answer. There isn't much chance to give more than one answer along the way. And the next point is, for most of the kids in the class, it's actually pretty darn boring. You're listening to a conversation in which you are vicariously involved. For everybody except the respondent, it's just listening to an oral conversation. And by the way, oral conversation goes a lot slower than your mind goes. So listening intrinsically to this kind of thing, not only you're not involved, but it's not really optimal in terms of what's called cognitive load. It's also read-only knowledge. So for most people in the class, and I'm using kind of the computer idea of, read-write, for most people in the class, you're just listening. That's what I mean by read. I don't mean literally read. I mean read as in read-write. But also what happens is this kind of classroom discourse has to happen within these four walls in this particular slot in the timetable. That's where there's not an option for it to happen anywhere else. That's where it must happen. But also what happens is this IRE pattern, classically, the person who starts the conversation is the teacher. The teacher initiates. When assessment comes, it's only indirectly related to what happens here. It's not actually assessing what happens here because it can't really be readily assessed, but it's something which is quite separate from the interaction here, and it's really about what's been remembered from that interaction. Now, let me just mention some R&D work that we've been doing. We've been building with research grants that we've got from the Federal Department of Education in the US and with the National Science Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We've been researching alternative digital learning environments. And one of the aspects of this research is how can we do classroom discourse differently? This is an environment called Scholar. As a matter of fact, we actually did a couple of versions of this same exercise in Australia when we were at RMIT University in Melbourne. But then we sort of kind of started again, built on that experience and started this building this environment again when we came to the US. When I say we, it's actually Mary Kalantzis and I who worked together on this particular endeavour. And here are a couple of screenshots from a classroom, and excuse my pun, up in the top left-hand corner there, a classroom doing the comedy of errors. And this is actually a grade 8 classroom in a little semi-rural school in Wisconsin. And I'm doing it with one of my master's students, Jessica Roon, who's a master's student in my program, a teacher in that school, and Rita Van Haren, who is going to present a follow-on workshop to this particular talk, and she's been a long-time collaborator in this process. So what happens is on the left, what we have is a screenshot of the Comedy of Errors community. We don't call it a class because a community could be a group within a class, or it could be multiple classes working together. So our kind of unit of collaboration is called the community. And there's an activity stream there of discussions that are being had, if you like to think of it that way. And on the right-hand side of the screen is a long screenshot where I sized it down a long way so you could actually see it as a long scroll, where the teacher has posted a very conventional exercise in some way about connotation, imagery, and symbol in the Comedy of Errors. And then down below that, the kids in the class begin to add their comment, and they press that little add a comment button and they talk to each other with the add button. So if you like, initiate, respond, evaluate. Well, initiate is the post the teacher's making there. Respond is the students answering. And you can see here that the teacher started talking to some of the students as they go. So they're all putting examples of this into the activity stream. Now, that just gives you a concrete idea of what a digital classroom discourse might look like. It's commonly happens in discussion boards, in wikis, in blogs. There are a lot of places where this happens. In the Scholar in the Scholar instance, though, we built something which is a funny hybrid. It's a cross between social media, Twitter, Facebook, and a blog. It's a bit of both. Because it's got an activity stream there like social media, but got a bigger space for discussion like a blog. And also this becomes a portfolio space where the students' work can be published and such like. Now, and by the way, here's the class. Here's the kids all doing their work. This is there's the teacher in my master's class there working with the kids. And this is a bigger picture of the whole area where there are small quiet areas, big open areas, and over there in a glass bubble in the very middle of things is the staff room. So where that's interconnected with the space as well. So what we had on the left with classical classroom discourse, I've grayed out, but I want to talk about the quite radical differences that have occurred in classroom discourse from the point of view of feedback, right? So I'm thinking of classroom discourse as a feedback system. So making the most of digital affordances. Everyone responds. So back there in this, if I click back to two things, back there in that right-hand side on the activity stream, we can actually insist that everybody comments, right? But the other thing that's kind of interesting is that there are lowered barriers to response. So that pressing that little comment button, you can type in a few words, you can think about it, you've got a bit of time. And the research we've done shows that the students who are a bit reticent, the ones who really need to speak and who don't normally speak, not only do they feel more comfortable about speaking, they can start to see some of the comments coming through in the feed. They can, if they're a bit nervous, they can wait before they press the button comment. And by the way, this can be live, when we're all together in the classroom. But also we can insist that they do. But the other very interesting shift is, it's a discussion, yes, but it's actually shifted to the written mode. So in orality, as Michael Halliday will tell us, there are no sentences. There's just a string of clauses and they're kind of all over the place. Whereas when you write, you've got sentences and you've got capital letters and you've got full stops and you've got all sorts of stuff. So this is an intermediate space which pushes students from the world of the vernacular, the world of something that might become academic literacy. It's a kind of a middle space. And whereas in the old school, the conversation is ephemeral and forgettable, here everything has been documented, right? So every thought the student has, it's there, it's documented, you can come back to it if you forget it, and therefore it's a kind of a mnemonic. You can come back and remember things that have been said if there's something you want to go back to. But also what's interesting is this notion that we call productive diversity. When everyone answers, there's, that Pluto question, which is what's the last planet? There's going to be some clever student that says, well, look, maybe in some definitions, Pluto is not a planet. And in fact, it's controversial now. So there's nothing in the world which is totally straightforward. But when the kids in the Comedy of Errors class are giving their answers, they're all different answers. And the dialogue is around different perspectives, different examples, different content. So the basic logic, our argument is that classical classroom discourse is an architecture which assumes sameness, that we're all going to give the same right answer. Whereas this environment is one which assumes that we're going to be different and there are important discussions to have around those differences. But also, it's not boring, it's engaging. There's a lot of stuff coming through and, you might think there's more than enough stuff coming through because, 30 kids all writing their comments, you can't engage with it all. But in fact, what we're very used to now with activity streams in social media is we're used to there being too much stuff. And part of the reading skill of the modern world is to speed read the stuff and filter out what's interesting from what's not, what's relevant from what's irrelevant in a kind of, so it's a different kind of reading along the way. But what it means is because we've got used to these places which demand high cognitive load, just listening is really boring. Also read, write knowledge. You know, in other words, that what happens is there's a balance, that you're doing as much reading as writing. You're responding a lot of the way. And one of the things that we, you know, the traditional classroom, it's more read than write. You know, and I mean this, I don't mean literally read and write. I mean read as in the listening and consuming stuff, than writing as in contributing and making stuff. But now, in fact, the aggregate amount of stuff that's going on, there's more stuff that's put in for the class by the students than by the teacher. Also, ubiquitous learning. Now, we can hold this conversation in the class, and it can be an accompaniment to speaking. Okay, write that down. Or it can be relatively silent where we talk over it a little bit. So it can be real, live and in the class, but also you can have this conversation overnight, finish the conversation and come back and let's talk about it in person again tomorrow, but let's continue the conversation in this asynchronous space as well. In the left-hand regime, mostly the teacher initiates, but here that everyone can initiate. So one little exercise that our teacher got the students to do is make a pile of sticky notes, post those, photograph them on the phone, post the sticky notes and make them as an update, which goes to the community. In other words, we can have the students much more co-designing the content by virtue of what they put in themselves. But the last point, and actually I'm jumping ahead here to a point that I'm going to reach in my third point in this talk, is learning analytics include the assessment of all classroom contributions, right? So in other words, what you can do is you can data mine this work that's occurring there, and you can keep a record. Did everybody respond to the question? Did they respond sufficiently? Who was talking to whom? So we can data mine all that activity in a way that, you know, the ephemeral oral world can't be data mined. So we can include classroom discourse as part of our assessment. So my second point, crowdsourcing feedback in rubric-based assessments. Now this is a quite different example in a whole lot of ways. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to give, there's a piece of classical written work on the right, and I'm going to talk about the old school model for this piece of work. Right, but also it's digital replicants, because we can do this old school stuff in digital environments. So linear, do your work, get feedback. And the answer is hand your work in. The teacher is exhausted reading 30 things which are darn well similar to each other, you know, makes a few spelling errors, puts a little comment on the end, and the answer is B+, which is kind of telling you that you are on the slightly better side of mediocre. Right, so it's kind of a linear process, but also the feedback. And this is the second point, is retrospective and judgmental. B+ is a judgment about who you are, and it's too late to do anything about it. I can't improve this piece of work I've done because I've got this. You know, it's not incremental feedback along the way. Also, what it does is the feedback positions learners as knowledge consumers. In other words, you know, you've been told what to do, you do it. The feedback is really validating whether you have done what you've been told to do. But also pen and paper knowledge artifacts don't look real. You know, this thing on the right is supposed to be a brochure which attracts you to this, well, it's attracting you to Canada. And there's the picture of Niagara Falls, and there's the bubble font for headings and whatever. So the students got the genre of a brochure, but also it's not terribly real. You know, there are no brochures like this in the world, and all you can do is feel like this is a second-rate brochure. That's the visual message you're getting from it. But the other thing is that what you're doing is that it's very much focused on cognition as content-focused thinking. So in other words, we're focused here on doing my brochure, which is about Canada and got these headings. So, you know, this is just a cognitive exercise. And the feedback essentially comes from teachers. We haven't built in student feedback along the way. And also it's summary that comes at the end. I finish my brochure, I get my B+. Now, I'm going to tell you now how things could be different. And what I'm going to do is just show you an example of a piece of work. This is a student in a class, Rita will talk about this process a bit later, doing peer review of a work. So, writing a work, a biography, and then doing peer review of it. So here we have on the left, this is a student who chose as her interesting character to write a biography about. And by the way, the prompt was find a person, an ordinary person who became famous and changed the world. And the example the student took was Rosa Parks, and she writes a multimodal text on the left. You can't see the editor in this particular version. This is my read-only version, but the editor allowed her to put in video and image and whatever. It was a multimodal editor. And then on the right, as she's writing, there's a rubric which comes from the standards. Okay. Now, what happens is this goes through a cycle, which I'm just going to show you diagrammatically what the cycle is. So this is in an area of Scholar called Creator. So the discussion example that I showed you was in an area of Scholar called Community. This is an area of Scholar called Creator. So we have these things called projects. So you write using the embedded rubric. You can see that in the previous slide. You're writing on the left and the rubric is on the right. Then what happens is you give and receive feedback using that rubric. So the other kids in the class have written about other famous people, famous sports people, famous scientists, whatever, who came from ordinary beginnings and became famous. So the interesting thing is that what we're doing is we're using a generalized rubric about biography and information writing, and they're applying the rubric which they use for their own writing to other people's students, other students' work. And then what we're doing is we're getting feedback on that. But also what we have is after you've given feedback, you get feedback on your feedback, which are those two subsidiary points there. So if we zip round now to point number 4, and by the way, in this particular scenario, there were 2 reviews you're doing. So 2 and 3, and then there were 2 lots of feedback you were giving on the other people's feedback on your work, which was 3A and 3B. So there were 2 reviews going on, but there could be any number, could be 1 or 3 or whatever you choose. And then what you do is you revise using the feedback and the rubric. So you actually do new work. And then what happens in this workflow is we get them to do, the students to do a self-review where they reflect on the feedback they were given and the changes they made. So they're kind of writing a reflective meta-analysis of the whole process. And then the works, point 6, get published out into a portfolio space so everybody gets to see them. Now, what we've done along the way, by the way, here, is made this big shift. This is the classical architecture on the left of the classroom. But what we're doing now is we've now changed that architecture where the teacher is still unbelievably important. But what they're doing is they're managing the peer review process. They're building an appropriate rubric or they're sourcing an appropriate rubric, and they're managing the process between the students. Now, as you can see from the heads of those arrows, there's a lot of complexity here. There's a lot of stuff going on. And one of the problems about doing this in a paper-based environment is just simply logistics. Now, what's great about digital environments is the logistics get managed. Like you've got 20 kids and there are 3 reviews. There are 60 peer review allocations which need to happen. That can be done in a randomized way. There can be automated dates when you have to have things done by and when alerts happen along the way. So it's actually quite a complex process. So the sociality of what you see on the right there is managed in this digital environment, and the complexity that would have otherwise been unmanageable gets managed. So this is what changed, or what changes when in these kinds of environments. So instead of it being linear, there's recursive feedback. So if I go back to here, you can see that there's lots of feedback and feedback on feedback, and there are many cycles of feedback where, in fact, if I go back to here, left side of the screen, I'm doing my work, I'm looking at the rubric. Then I get 2 other people's work on the left and I write a review. And then I get my work back and I look at their reviews. Then I revise it, then I write a self-review. So we've got this kind of recursive process where you're refining what you're doing based on these cycles of feedback, one after the other. But also feedback is prospective and constructive. One of the things we ask people to do who use this environment, and which we do ourselves, is when you make a peer review rubric, don't make its orientation retrospective and judgmental. Did you do this well? No. Make it prospective and constructive. How might you, what were the strengths and weaknesses of this, and how might you build on those? How might you improve on what you've done? How might you extend what you've done? What we've also got in this environment is one where we're positioning learners as knowledge producers. They're writing biographies. They're sharing them between each other. But also what we're doing is that those unreal pieces of writing, which are embarrassingly untrue to the world and feel like they're just not very good writing, it's not a real brochure that we saw before. The knowledge artifacts that are being produced here, which have embedded video and which are produced to the web, look real because you're using exactly the same artifacts that people would be using when they were making the real thing. Instead of cognition as content thinking, what we have is metacognition as disciplinary thinking. So let me go back to this one here. On the left, you've got thinking, which is a biography of Rosa Parks. And on the right, you've got metacognition, or thinking about thinking, which is what are the conditions under which we write a good information text, and in particular, a biography. So, but also what we're doing is we're crowdsourcing feedback. So the teacher can put their review in, but along the way, what we've got is we've got peer reviews, we've got self-reviews, the teacher can put in their score on something. So what we're getting is many bits of feedback from many perspectives, but almost the most important aspect of this at all is that the key feedback doesn't happen at the end. It happens after you've done a first draft, and it's formative. It actually helps your learning in a very, very constructive, direct kind of way. So my last example of feedback, and this is experimental work that we've been doing here at the University of Illinois with the grants that we've been very fortunate to get. This is the traditional model of assessment, right? So at the end of the semester, you go and do a test, and this is kind of, metaphorically, you know what this means, you know what the blinkers mean. Now, this is what assessment traditionally has been. It's at the end. It's either at the end of the course, or at the end of the school year, or at the end of the week if it's a quiz, and it's a very limited sample. When we do assessment, it's not, and one of the problems is that I was feeling lousy on that day, or I forgot something. We know the classical critiques of this kind of limited sampling method. But what it's also sampling is long-term memory. They can't talk to each other, they can't bring their books in, those people in the photograph. And in a sense, what it reduces knowledge to is long-term memory of anything, right? And literally anything, chemistry, poetry, the novels you've read, or whatever. And what it is, it's the recall. What it's oriented to is the recall of facts, or the correct application of memorized procedures. So, in the case of subject English, you've learned how to do your 5-paragraph essay. You've learned some key words like metaphor, or allegory, or whatever it is. You know how to apply them, and it's about correct application. Fear-inspiring experience, we know that. It's nervous-making, because what if you stuff up? What if you forget something? But also, it's very much focused on individual intelligence. And by the way, I've just realized I shouldn't have put big data learning and artificial intelligence there. That line is a mistake. That's from the other side of the point. So my apologies for that. And because I'm this far into a Zoom video, I'm going to just apologize rather than go back and redo it. But also what it does is that this is a process where we insist on inequality. Now, what do I mean by that? I want to go back to the person who invented the bell curve, a man by the name of Henry Goddard, very famous, very important person who mathematicized intelligence testing, right? And this is the bell curve. This is how he did it. And by the way, 100 is your boringly average person, right? And all the things on the right-hand side, we like those words because we still have above average gifted, and maybe we might even call somebody a genius. We don't like his words on the left anymore, which were 0 to 25 is an idiot, 26 to 50 is an imbecile, 51 to 70 is a moron. These distinctions now are lost on us, but nevertheless, they're words we don't like using. But in fact, that's what we're doing when we put people across a bell curve. So what we often do is we come in and think, well, there's got to be a reasonable distribution of results across the bell curve. So a few people can think they're outstanding and rah, 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 good for them. And the majority can think, okay, well, I'm sort of okay and mediocre, that's me. And the rest of them can think, okay, I'm not very good at all. So this is what we do with any sort of statistical distribution like this. Now, I want to give you an alternative now in the Scholar environment. And in fact, this is, in fact, it's a higher ed class, but we did use this exact same device with the Shakespeare class that you saw earlier on. And Rita may talk to you about that a little bit. And by the way, Rita and Jessica Haroon, Rita Van Haren and Jessica Haroon wrote up a paper, published a paper about that experience. So the students in that class had this visualization, but I'm showing you one actually from one of my classes in a higher ed context. And this thing is called an aster plot. And what an aster plot does, an aster is a type of daisy. It measures things in the petals, and as things get bigger, the color moves out. So when you start a unit of work or a course or whatever you're measuring with this aster plot, the number in the center is 0. So theta is an old testing concept. And what we happen to be measuring here is 3 different qualities, knowledge qualities. One is knowledge itself, things we can demonstrate that you've learned. Focus is the amount of work you've done, and help is the amount of a collaboration measure, right? And we're measuring all sorts of different things in here. Now, in fact, this is just a screenshot, so I can't show it to you dynamically, but as you mouse over each, it tells you exactly how it's being calculated. Now, this is my whole class view, but every student has their own view of their own aster plot and how they're going. Now, in this particular class, I had about 30, 40 students, and it was an 8-week course at a master's level. In fact, by the end of the course, there were 14,500 pieces of actionable feedback. In other words, one comment that was made, one response to something you posted in a discussion, one comment on a comment, one rating in a peer review rubric, one comment. So there were lots and lots of pieces of interim feedback coming in. But in fact, when I added up all the classroom discourse, no, I didn't add it up, I couldn't add it up. Here, there were like 3.3 million pieces of items in, they had to do 2 peer-reviewed projects, they had to make 7 updates in the space, they had to comment on the stuff I'd done. There was a lot of stuff they had to do in the 8 weeks, but in fact, what we've got here is big data, right? But down there on the right, you can see that what we've got is very, very granular data, in that we've actually measured 25 different things along the way. So, so this is, now, by the way, the point that I want to make in contrast to this is as follows. There we are, the distribution curve, where we want everybody to get, we want to spread people out, even no matter what. Whereas here, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, the circumference of that circle, we have determined in the admin settings, it takes not much time to set these up, 10, 15 minutes. We've determined what we want your outcomes to be on every one of these measures. And you can watch yourself as you get there incrementally. And by the way, what I say to my students is that 80 is an A. And if you want to get an A, just keep building on your aster plot. Do more of this, do more of that, refine that or improve that. And the underlying idea behind this is an old idea, by the way, an idea, a phrase created by Benjamin Bloom, the inventor of the Bloom's taxonomy. He had another very clever idea, which was called mastery learning, which is that in theory, the curve doesn't have to be this way. We can push the curve way over to the right, because some of the learners might take longer, they might you know, it might be more effort, but in fact, we've let them into the class. And because we let them into the class, it must mean that mastery is possible. So the least we can do is push the curve to the right and maybe even do away with the need for a curve like this. So in other words, it's possible with incremental feedback, these many, many small pieces of feedback, to work your way towards mastery. And if you don't make it to mastery, it's because maybe you stopped, or maybe you know, or do more if you want to reach that point. So my conclusions about this third point, and this is getting towards the end of the talk now, is that what we've got is we've got an assessment in we've got a revolution in assessment as well. So we're assessing everything as you go, as long as it's being recorded in these digital environments. If we can move classroom discourse into the digital environment, and, you know, that's not to say we shouldn't have oral discourse, but for goodness sake, also write down what you're thinking, write down what you're saying, put it down there as well. Instead of long-term memory, we've got authentic disciplinary practice. Instead of simply recalling facts, we've got higher order thinking, critical, creative, or design thinking. Instead of assessment being a fear-inspiring experience, we've got embedded assessment, which is the learner's friend, because it's giving you feedback all the time from your peers, machine feedback, and the like. And then the next point is, instead of individual intelligence, the individuals working collaboratively in an intelligent learning ecology. Look, my peers are giving me answers. You know, in the picture of that a testing room, you know, you couldn't have the peers giving you answers. But here, what we're doing is they're giving you feedback. You're acknowledging that feedback in the peer review, and we have an audit trail or a complete set of ways of tracking the provenance of ideas, where the student acknowledges the way in which their peers have helped them. And by the way, the other bit of collaborative intelligence is look things up. You know, don't plagiarize. You know, if you want to put something in as a quote, make it a quote and cite it. Don't plagiarize, but we're expecting that you're going to have these things at the end of your fingertips, which, getting back to the long-term memory point, are, if you like, kind of cognitive prostheses, things that help us remember. And because we have these all the time anyhow, why would we bother with long-term memory? The name of the game now is the social knowledge that we can either access from our peers, or we can access by looking stuff up and having a critical eye to what's a good source and what's not. So on the right-hand side here, again, I made a mistake with the left-hand side, is it shouldn't be that, you know, on the left. I think the opposite of this is, you know, assessment coming at the end. On the right-hand side, we've got these incremental progress reports, a variety of different types of data coming in along the way, a very large number of data points. But also, this is where artificial intelligence comes in, where the system can be tracking what the users are doing, and the system itself becomes smart about and the system is able to give answers because it sees what answers or what things what the students are saying to each other. That's a bit of a long story, but this is where the really cutting edge work is going to be done in the future. This is a domain which is called machine learning, and the kind of trap about artificial intelligence and machine learning is that it isn't really artificial at all, and it isn't really just the machine. It's the machine recording a lot of data from human interactions and then reapplying that data at another point. That's all machine learning is. But there are enormous potentials in that area along the way. And then the last point, which is for me almost the most important one, instead of insisting on inequality, insisting that we put people across that curve, we have mastery learning, where every student can succeed because they can see their progress moving incrementally towards in the case of the astroplot, the circumference of the circle. So that's the end of my talk about feedback. If you'd like to know more, we have new learning communities in CG Scholar, and in we have a website for a start. This is our website, so there's lots of information on that site, newlearningonline.com. But then we have these e-spaces as well. Anyone can set up an account for free in CG Scholar. Just by way of background, the community and creator spaces are fully open and free. If you want to use the peer review space, We have a not-for-profit where we charge a very modest amount of money. It's based at the university, in the research park at the university, where we charge a very modest amount for the peer review functions and for the analytics functions. And then we have a Facebook page and a Twitter feed as well. And of course, that's my email address if anybody would like to contact me. So thank you very much, folks. And I hope this proved to be a thought-provoking and interesting session. And I'm going to wish you all the very best for the rest of your conference. Bye then.